The Last of Us Part 2. By far the most controversial game of 2020, perhaps even of all time. It was also my most anticipated game of that year. At least until huge story moments were leaked and those leaks caused an outrage, and that outrage made me hesitate to buy the game on the launch date. I tried to avoid the spoilers, but it was almost impossible. I heard of the now infamous golf club scene, of Abby's motive, Ellie's quest for revenge, and her ultimate hesitance to act it out. I didn't know the context, however, and only actually saw little of it. Still, I decided to wait. I let it drift out of my immediate radius of games to play and focused on Ghost of Tsushima, Death Stranding, and various other games for the time being. The urge to play The Last of Us Part 2 never faded, but it strangely didn't feel right for me to play it yet. I was anxious about how I would end up feeling about the game. Previously, I felt the same way about Death Stranding, and ended up loving it. Even when sitting in the main menu, I still didn't feel quite ready. For years, I have sought out games that manage to invest me emotionally, that make me feel something. If a game leaves me cold, I quickly forget about it. And so I developed a taste for games that make me feel terrible after finishing them, making me unable to think about anything else for days. It sounds masochistic, I know. A lot of these games left me sad yet strangely fulfilled, left me with a newfound sense of clarity, catharsis. This is exactly what I wanted from The Last of Us Part 2. And that's exactly what I got. Before I take a deep dive into the story, I want to talk about the gameplay. Overall, the gameplay is very similar to the first game. It's indeed shocking that it isn't a big departure. For me, the gameplay of the original Last of Us was solid. When I heard reviewers say that the gameplay is almost the same in Part 2, I admit I was a bit disappointed. Upon playing it myself, I found it to be improved in every single way. I love the combat, it's polished to perfection, feels even more intense than in the first game, and the immersion just grips you and doesn't let go. The animations and the sound design are almost unmatched. Stealth plays an even bigger role than before, and it's strengthened by the abilities to craft silencers for the pistol, to go prone, and more open level design. Being able to go prone may sound like a small thing, but it added a lot of depth to each encounter. Literally. When stealth breaks apart, the new ability to dodge melee attacks also really makes a difference for the gameplay. None of these mechanics are groundbreaking, but they feel so fluid and adequate that I don't care. It doesn't have to be innovative to feel good. It's literally just an improved version of the first game with a few additions in both gameplay and level design, which is all it really needed. The game delves deeper into horror this time around, bringing a nice change into the combat scenarios. Encounters such as the stalkers in the newspaper offices and the Rat King fight in the hospital had my heart racing. The latter even felt like a Resident Evil boss fight. Speaking of encounters, I loved how they generally kept getting more complex and then returned to simplicity for a while. Most of them are phenomenal, often implementing unique twists so that they never become dull. For example, some encounters include both human and infected enemies that you can pit against each other. Some are claustrophobic, some are wide open, and others yet allow you to use water to your advantage. I ultimately used stealth as Ellie whenever I could and went into open combat as Abby more often than not. On my second playthrough, I reduced the ammo available to make the combat even more tense to great effect. Some of the later encounters on higher difficulties are brutal though, leaving stealth can be a death sentence. Gameplay mix-ups between Ellie and Abby contribute to the variety. Different guns, abilities, environmental puzzles and distinct set pieces. My favorite ones are probably the whole skyscraper part, the car chase and the Rat King boss fight I mentioned earlier. Exploration is another highlight for me. I had a lot of fun taking my time and just exploring every level, partially thanks to just how beautiful this game looks. Every level feels well designed, distinct, and it all fits into this hypnotizing world. The pacing may not be perfect, which I'll get to later, but the levels on their own? Fantastic. Figuring out safe codes, searching buildings for supplies, and finding notes that tell little stories which reward and immerse you for exploring the world. Again, nothing groundbreaking, but executed very well. Also, can we talk about that guitar minigame? Such a cool addition. The gameplay, the world, the atmosphere, the visuals are all fantastic. They are not the reason why you are here and not what sparked such a huge controversy. They are not why I made this video. No, it's the story and the game's position as the sequel to one of the most critically acclaimed games ever.
Come on, baby girl. I got you. I got you. Cover the exit. Don't let him get away.
I've heard countless accusations about this game being an unnecessary sequel that doesn't do the original justice, that it's too different, strays away from the core of the original, and even betrays its characters. Here is my perspective. The Last of Us has always been about Joel and Ellie, but they are ultimately vessels to tell a greater message about humanity. In that regard, not much has changed in Part 2. There are a lot of parallels to the first game. Both games start with a protagonist losing a loved one. Both of these deaths are catalysts for a central character development. It affects them throughout the entirety of the story in both their mindsets and their actions. They both end on a bittersweet note. The events of Part 2 are a direct consequence of Part 1, continuing the story in a meaningful, if depressing, way. Furthermore, the events of Part 2 are constantly foreshadowed in the first game. Let me show you a few examples that might have been just meant for the first game, but actually make a lot of sense for the sequel too.
Can't imagine losing someone you love like that. Losing everything that you know.
Well, no matter how hard you try, I guess you can't escape your past.
Being by myself. I'm scared of ending up alone.
These are just a few lines that really resonate in Part 2. They hint at the parallels and themes that I'll get to in the next section. So, what did change then? The scope of the story and the complexity of the narrative. The original game was a simple story, told effectively through a small cast of great characters. On the surface, the story of Part 2 may appear simple as well. Taking a closer look disillusions that notion. A lot of the complexity comes from the huge amount of subtext that leaves plenty of room for interpretation, far more than the first game. The expense? Consistency. For example, Abby is shown to feel guilty, but she never explicitly states that it's because of what she did to Joel. The closest evidence we get is Abby's reaction to what Owen tells her on the sailboat.
Sorry I grew up. You should try it.
Oh yeah, how do I do that? Should I go find the people that killed my family? Cut into them? I could torture them until they're crying, you know?
It's unclear though if she feels guilty for the act of killing Joel, for the effect it had to the people around Joel, or maybe she isn't even entirely sure herself. We are dealing with troubled people after all, with difficult pasts. Maybe she feels guilty for encouraging her father to do the surgery on Ellie that led to his death. A sense of guilt the game also hints at. It's also plausible that she just wants to move on from simply everything that has anything to do with her father and Joel. I will get into this topic in more detail later on. This was just to show a difference between the two games. There is plenty of subtext in the first game too, but it's much less convoluted. The first game's structure is very linear, following Joel and Ellie on their journey to Salt Lake City. Part 2's structure is very different. It consists of a prologue in Jackson, the events in Seattle split between Ellie and Abby's perspectives, with a flashback after every day, and the epilogue in Santa Barbara and the farm. The structure itself isn't a problem to me, but in execution the pacing suffers. Quite a few points in the game feel stretched out, and the character switch obviously plays a role as well. A common complaint about this game is that Naughty Dog betrayed Joel's character, that he would never be so naive to trust complete strangers, and isn't the same Joel we knew. My answer to that is both yes and no. I believe it makes sense. Think about it, the Joel from the first game was living a very rough life, facing threats at every corner. After the events of the first game, he was able to live in peace in Jackson. He didn't have to worry about death lurking around every corner. In the 5 years he lived there, he got used to people being friendly and became less suspicious of him. He settled down. It's a completely different environment from a city like Boston. When Ellie tells him that she would like to try to forgive him, I'm sure he's in a great mindset. And so when he saves a stranger's life the day after and accepts that stranger's offer of shelter from a snowstorm, I don't think it betrays his character. It's even implied in the patrol logs that this wasn't the first time he helped a stranger like that. There might have been better ways to kill off Joel, but this one was still believable to me. It unleashes exactly the right feelings in the player that the story needs: confusion, anger and sadness. The relationship between Joel and Ellie as a core pillar of The Last of Us is not disregarded in part 2 by killing Joel so early on. Joel is just as vital to this story as he was to the last. Everything that happens in part 2 happens because of Joel. While he may not be physically there for a large part of the story, his impact on all of the characters' lives echoes through all of it. The flashbacks with Ellie and Joel were fantastic, and they wouldn't be nearly as heartbreaking or meaningful if Joel didn't die. He is still a main character, and honestly, I can't imagine a part 2 where Joel stays alive at this point. When I first played through the game, Joel's death wrecked me. Maybe I'm not the strongest person when it comes to emotions, but this really made me feel sick for a few days. I cannot remember a single piece of media I consumed in my life that had such an extreme effect. It's hard for me to relate to people who laughed or felt absolutely nothing in that scene. Where would his story go in a more meaningful way than this? Some people would have preferred if it went nowhere, that there was no sequel. I agree that his story is already told, which is why I think that the way they chose to continue his story is actually genius. His story is told and he dies, yet his death and everything that he did before is a major driving force for the story. I've heard a number of ideas how the story should have continued, with Joel alive for at least most of it. I love Joel as a character, but none of them resonated with me.
Good night, kiddo.
I'm sorry about your daughter, Joel, but I have lost people too.
You have no idea what loss is.
A core theme of the original The Last of Us was loss. Joel lost his daughter in a very abrupt and cruel way and had to learn to live with that, to accept it. 20 years later, he met Ellie and slowly but surely built a strong bond with her. When he realizes that he is about to lose yet another daughter figure and that he would have to deal with the same pain again that haunted him for 2 decades, he murders every single person standing in his way in order to keep her alive. Joel could not accept losing her. The same theme is ever present in the second game. Ellie lost a lot of people who were close to her and became scared of ending up alone. She met Joel and slowly but surely built a strong bond with him. When she finds out what Joel had done, she can't forgive him. But deep down, she still has the desire to love him as a surrogate father. And when she loses Joel in an extremely abrupt and cruel way, just as she was starting to forgive him, she can't accept losing him. the opportunity to rebuild her bond with Joel violently ripped from her, causes her to murder every single person standing in her way in order to seek revenge. She didn't see any other way to deal with her pain. She didn't want to see another way. Only when revenge is in the palm of her hand does she realize that she has to accept it. There is no escaping it. Side note, that's a parallel to Abby, who also lost her father figure, tried to deal with it by killing Joel, which didn't help her mental state at all. Acceptance is the only way. She lost her opportunity to make peace with Joel and had to go to extreme lengths to accept that she can't change it. She realizes that she has to choose humanity over revenge, that she has to move on and let go. Massive character growth that also makes Joel's death even more meaningful. She couldn't move on from what Joel had done in the Firefly Hospital, but now she could at least move on from this and not lose herself completely. The Last of Us has always been about imperfect people doing bad things for relatable reasons. This idea is stretched to its maximum and then some in this game. I think it's intentionally stretched so far that we are on the brink of losing that relatability. The length Ellie goes to in order to deal with her trauma becomes increasingly unrelatable. In the beginning, we are meant to feel exactly like Ellie, confused, angry, sad. The further the story progresses, however, we are meant to take a step back when we see how far she crosses over the line, if there even is such a thing as a line in that world. We see how this path destroys her. Ellie's PTSD is only fully shown once in the game. Some regard this as a poor representation of what PTSD is actually like, but it's arbitrary to only happen once in just the right time and place. While I have no idea what PTSD is actually like, it didn't just kick in once for Ellie. If you take a look into her journal at the farm, you'll see that this has happened again and again. An example. It happened again. I was hunting this boar and I'd cornered it in this old gas station. It was bleeding out, screaming, sounded like him. When I couldn't get the images out of my head, I left it there, dying. My skin hurts. It's a detail that is easy to overlook. Speaking of Ellie's PTSD, let's get into the mess that is Ellie's inner conflict. The first time that Ellie went after Abby was already fueled by trauma, but overshadowed by hatred. The second time she goes after Abby, there is no hatred. Ellie realized that this is purely about making her trauma stop at that point. In the final scene with both characters, it's clear that neither of them actually hates the other one, despite what they have done to each other. They've gone through too much and are too exhausted to feel any hate. When Ellie sees the state that Abby is in when she finds her, she hesitates to outright kill her. Perhaps she realizes what she is doing is madness. Only when they are about to leave on separate boats, Ellie takes a look at her blood. The image of Joel's mutilated head flashes. She turns around and tells Abby that she can't let her leave. She can't. Maybe she would like to, but in her mind she believes that she can't in order to stop her pain. The hate is long gone, it's just about making it stop. Ellie convinced herself that this is solely about Abby, that she is the one to blame for everything, that killing her will make everything better. It was just an illusion that Ellie forced upon herself to deal with her loss. It's the easier option, at least for the short term. Needless to say, that didn't work. Ellie's trauma came from the lost opportunity to make peace with Joel, abruptly taken from her. Not from the simple fact that he got killed by Abby. I think she also feels partly responsible for Joel's death, but tries to deny it. Obviously, Ellie had no control over that. Though it would make for an interesting parallel that both Ellie and Abby feel an unjustified responsibility for the deaths of Joel and Jerry respectively. What I've talked about is never explicitly said in the game. It's my interpretation of the subtext of what the game is actually trying to tell us. As much as I appreciate subtle storytelling, this may have gone too far. It's a bit too unclear. Acceptance is another major theme of The Last of Us and is closely intertwined with loss. This game isn't just a story about revenge equals bad, it's a lot more nuanced than that, but also more convoluted. Both Ellie's and Abby's desire for revenge is driven by their inability to accept the unchangeable, to move on and let go. It's why Abby is eager for the opportunity to fulfill her inner desire, even 5 years after her loss. She can't let go. Killing Joel at that point was just senseless. It didn't suddenly make her happy. The only thing it achieved was unleashing the same feelings in Ellie that she once felt herself. I know it's a meme at this point, but this cycle just continues into destruction. Even if it leads to justice, it doesn't lead to happiness or salvation. It takes Ellie the entire game to kill dozens of people, to torture Nora, to lose Jesse, to have Abby submerged underwater on the brink of death, to accept this and find it in herself to forgive. Forgive not just Abby, but Joel, and mostly herself. Forgive herself for psychologically torturing Joel by not forgiving him and pushing him away until it was essentially too late. She couldn't move past Joel and Abby for a long time until she felt ready to try. Ellie's reluctance to do so is even teased at the start of the game, when she can't even forgive Seth for using a homophobic slur, justified or not. But maybe I'm reaching a bit with this one. Why is all of this convoluted, you may ask? Well, it's not entirely clear if Ellie's inner conflict is just about her inability to properly accept Joel's death, struggle to forgive both Joel and Abby for what they have done, deal with her PTSD of seeing her father figure being killed right in front of her, or all of those and more. It's not entirely clear if Ellie did actually forgive Abby at the end, or if it was never really about her in the first place. The lack of dialogue between them hints towards the latter, but there is no confirmation. By the way, while I really like that she ends up sparing Abby, it might have been equally interesting to see Ellie kill her, especially after making you sympathize with her. It would have made the ending even more bleak though, for better and for worse. Throughout the game, it's shown with guitars and flashbacks that Ellie is still holding on to Joel. Maybe she just finally realized that letting go from Joel is the only way to find peace. My best interpretation is that all of this is true, it's convoluted, it's a mess, but so is Ellie.
Don't ever let me see you again. Come on.
The limited dialogue between Ellie and Abby sparks the question if they already have a mutual understanding because they share similarities, just don't care what the other person thinks, or if it is actually lazy writing. I believe the most likely is the former because of the scene at the beach in Santa Barbara. Abby knows that Ellie came after her because of Joel. She knows that she cut into the people around Joel, like Owen said, and how it drives Ellie to pursue her years after it happened and cut into her people. Just like she couldn't find peace when her father died. She knows that she and Ellie have a lot in common. Ellie doesn't know the exact reason why Abby went after Joel. She only finds out that it has something to do with the Fireflies, but she probably doesn't care. She does seem to understand Abby though. I don't have solid evidence for that, however. It's just a feeling. Ellie likely feels the same way as I do. No concrete evidence, but still an understanding, regardless. Perhaps she just feels like she knows she isn't that different from Abby deep down. Is that just lazy writing? Maybe. Regardless, the relationship between Ellie, Abby and Joel is simple on the surface, but very deep yet extremely convoluted underneath. Complexity at the cost of consistency. The way all of the story themes and character arcs are told is a total mess, but in my eyes, that doesn't diminish their depth. It paved the way for long discussions, which is something I have really enjoyed when they were constructive. What I am absolutely sure about are the themes Naughty Dog wanted to discuss with this game, even if they are not conveyed as consistently as they could have been. No, revenge is not the main theme of this game. It appears to be at first, but it's not. That's only the surface level. It's about loss, trauma, acceptance, forgiveness and perspective. How we deal with it when there's no higher power to judge or guide us. Only raw nature set free in the aftermath of society's downfall.
No. Just take him.
The WLF and Seraphites' conflict acts as an example of how the tribalistic nature of us and them can destroy us if we take it too far. Neither side was willing to understand the other. I believe through meeting and helping Yara and Lev, Abby realizes just how pointless the whole conflict is. She breaks out of it just in time. It's a large-scale reflection of the conflict between Ellie and Abby. Both are driven by primal nature and leave a path of destruction behind them. With its violent and beautiful moments, this game perfectly shows the two sides of the indifferent force we call nature. Seeing Abby feel guilty and try to become a better person through helping Yara and Lev was interesting. It only reached the same level of engagement as Ellie's story for me on the second playthrough though. I'm still more connected to Ellie, so this doesn't come as a surprise. In that, I sure wasn't alone. The most controversial part about this game is undoubtedly Abby. What Naughty Dog tried to do with her was very risky, and it obviously didn't work for everyone. For the first half of the game, you're put right into Ellie's shoes. You are hell-bent on tracking Abby down and making her pay for what she did to Joel. It's made out to be a classic revenge story, not a unique premise, but still very engaging thanks to the brilliant presentation. Instead of continuing down that path, Naughty Dog decided to make an experiment. After making you hate her with her passion, they tried to bring you around and understand her perspective, maybe even relate to her. I appreciated all the parallels drawn between her and Ellie. The two characters aren't that different from each other and are both at different stages of the same cycle. Abby is going through a redemption arc after exerting revenge, while Ellie is still in the revenge arc. Both of their real enemies are not another person. It's their PTSD, and that at least becomes absolutely clear towards the end. Abby's desire to help Lev and Yara might come from her regret that she couldn't save her father, but maybe now could save them. In a twisted way, you could argue that's what Ellie does in the end as well. Ignoring the fight between her and Abby, she did ultimately cut them down from the pillars and let them drive away in a boat. At the end of Ellie's Seattle Day 3, you're thrown right into a flashback of Abby and her father. It turns out that he was the lead surgeon of the Fireflies. When Joel and Ellie arrived at St. Mary's Hospital and they found out that Ellie would die during the surgery, Abby's father hesitated. Ultimately, Abby convinced him that it's the right thing to do. As we all know though, Joel ended up killing a lot of Fireflies who stood in his way, and as we now know, Abby's father. We finally understand why Abby did what she did. The issue? At that point, a lot of players simply did not want to understand her. While I understand that Naughty Dog wanted to make you absolutely hate her at the start and then slowly bring you around, not everyone was on board for that. I personally already knew why Abby wanted to kill Joel months before even owning the game. I never hated her, because I knew that her motive was sort of understandable from the very beginning. Perhaps it would have been a better choice to place this flashback at some point near the start of the game. Maybe then more players would have been willing to understand her, but it would have disrupted the game's vision for a wider appeal, which is not something I condone. It might have taken away from the game's impact, because you follow Ellie and her story and her perspective and then switch over, and it's like a complete contrast, and if you were to mix these two constantly, it would definitely disrupt the experience. Perhaps it's different for everyone. I knew a lot of story beats all along, and the game still hit me like a truck. I am probably the exception though. Making the antagonist likable after killing a beloved main character is almost impossible, especially when you purposefully make the player hate her at the start. It might not matter which way you spin it, it would have still irritated some players, possibly unavoidable with a story like this. After seeing her journey, I sympathized with Abby on my first playthrough, but grew to really like her on the second. And that's the thing, perspective is hugely important in this game. It makes sense then that viewing the characters and events while already knowing what happens lets you appreciate characters like Abby more. It was a risky choice, but even if I didn't like it, I would still commend Sony and Naughty Dog for taking such a risk. We should encourage studios to take risks with their games, because like all art forms, they thrive on new and risky ideas. Back to the actual game, after the flashback, you play Seattle Day 1 to 3 from Abby's perspective. This has a heavy effect on the pacing, to no one's surprise. The game was building up to a climax in Ellie's part, and then it feels like it's going full stop when Abby's part starts. For those who are already unwilling to understand Abby's perspective, the pacing taking a knee was probably just the cherry on top. These 3 days are almost the same length as the last. It makes the entire experience almost feel like 2 games in one. It's kind of a dilemma. While the length of Abby's part combined with Ellie's destroys the pacing, It's also necessary to an extent to make you care about her. I say to an extent because the first game only needed 20 minutes at the start to make you care about Joel. In fairness though, we are talking about an entirely different situation here. For me personally, the fun gameplay scenarios and Abby's redemption arc did make up for the bad pacing in the end. Though on my first playthrough I didn't mind the pacing, I even took my time exploring every corner of every level like I said. On my second one, the pacing issues constantly stuck out, not just in Abby's part but also in Ellie's. Both should have been shorter, even if it came at the expense of some cool gameplay moments. Especially Ellie's Seattle Day 1 and 3 and Day 1 for Abby drag on for far too long. Nonetheless, I explored every corner yet again because I just love this world. What surprised me is that I found Abby's story just as interesting as Ellie's the second time through. Overcoming bias can go a long way to find enjoyment in this game.
She's pregnant. Good. Abby! What the hell are you doing here?
You think I'd let you do this on your own?
Beside the story choices themselves, I believe a lot of other factors played into the controversy around this game. First of all, the leaks and the misleading marketing. The marketing for The Last of Us Part 2 was questionable to say the least, removing characters from scenes, replacing them, changing the models, and even recording a voice line that is spoken by an entirely different character in the game. When the leaks hit and revealed the truth, people were irritated, and I can't blame them. The story that was hinted at in the trailers is very different from what we actually got. The keyword is hinted because they are not explicit about the story's actual premise, but of course some theories became popular online that were far away from the truth, especially after the trailers made it seem like Joel would stay alive. So how should the story have been marketed? Imagine if they had made it clear that Joel dies at the start and that his death leads to everything else. It's likely that it would have caused a similar hurricane of negative feedback like the leaks did, though the fact that they hid Joel's death probably increased the impact of the leaks. The negativity might have been a bit less if Naughty Dog had been more transparent, who knows. Naughty Dog knew what kind of backlash it would cause, both in the marketing and in the game itself. I believe they feared people wouldn't give the story they were trying to tell a chance if they had just blurted out that Joel dies early on, and they might have been right. I think they should have neither outright shown that Joel dies, nor mislead people like they did. Naughty Dog absolutely nailed the harrowing atmosphere of the game in the trailers, and they kept the story vague enough to not really give anything away, but still convey the feeling that something will go horribly wrong. So yes, my solution in regard to Joel's death would basically be to keep the trailers as they are and simply not change the character models and that one voice line. Show it like it is in the game. As for Abby, well, that's a different story. I think it's good that they didn't tell us you would play as her for such a big part of the game. However, I think she should have been more present in the trailers overall. She had that one trailer that was one of the cutscenes in her part of the game, but that wasn't enough. I understand that especially the story trailer already wanted to give you that feeling of being in Ellie's narrow-minded shoes to strengthen the impact of the perspective switch. It would have been much better though if they had just shown little snippets of cutscenes from Abby's story to hint that there's more to it than a classic tale of revenge. Another part of the controversy is the clear social political influence on this game. Abby's physique, Lev's gender, a multicultural cast of characters in general are definitely politically driven when you look at the shift at Naughty Dog in recent years. Neil Druckmann in particular might have been the catalyst of this. His interviews and tweets hinted that much. He has been in a vital position in the company's last few projects. Some of the current developers are hostile on Twitter against any kind of criticism they consider right-wing, with little regard for constructive value. It's a bit ironic that a company that prides itself on being inclusive and tolerant is now very intolerant to those who disagree with them. It's easy to see why people don't like that. However, this goes both ways, as the toxicity of a certain group of fans has been absolute madness, and ultimately much worse. The shift in game direction becomes clear as day when you compare the first few Uncharted games to The Last of Us 1, to Uncharted 4, to The Lost Legacy, to The Last of Us Part 2. A game like Uncharted 2 didn't try its hardest to include people of all colors and sexualities. The Last of Us Part 2 does. Developers have every right to include any kind of person or sexuality in their game. Now, there is a problem with diversity these days, mostly with products made by larger corporations. You've probably heard many people talk about it already, but I feel the need to bring it up here. Identity is an important part of a character, their origin, appearance and sexuality. However, it should never be the only trait they have. It's neither realistic nor believable. Sadly, it's often that superficial today. The greatest offenders are Hollywood blockbusters. In the case of The Last of Us Part 2, I went in expecting it to be that hypocritical superficiality, but I was wrong. Yes, in the case of Lev, his identity is incredibly important to his character, but it makes a lot of sense in his case, as it provides a meaningful addition to the story. Apart from him though, Naughty Dog doesn't feel the need to constantly point these things out. Ellie is lesbian, Dina is bisexual and Jewish, Jesse is Asian American, and so on. The important thing is that there is so much more to them than that. Yes, it is shown and referenced at times, but why shouldn't it be? It's implemented naturally and it's not overdone. I also appreciate that the game doesn't fall into the strong independent woman stereotype that is often closely related to the diversity problem. That stereotype is often equally superficial, usually being a character that never does anything wrong, never goes through serious hardship, but possesses arrogance as a single character trait and derives the concept of strength only from the stereotype of a muscular and stoic man. It's insanely shallow and ironic. Yes, sadly Abby's physique falls into the trap of literally looking male, when naturally built muscular women simply never look like that. And Abby is neither transgender nor on steroids. Probably. That's the only issue I have though. Otherwise, neither Abby nor Ellie fall to that stereotype. They are strong, yes, but they both do plenty wrong, suffer immensely, and are both characters with deeper personalities. To wrap all of this up, there is definitely a social political side to this game that wasn't in Naughty Dog's earlier games, and it seems to have irritated some people. For the toxic developers on Twitter, I too have a distaste. For what they did in the game, I mostly do not, for the reasons I have explained. In the context of the leaks and the marketing though, it definitely fueled the fire even more. It's also important to keep in mind that this dark and depressing game was released in the middle of a pandemic, when a lot of people were subconsciously looking for uplifting stories. All of these factors lead to the unfortunate situation around the game that we are all familiar with.
Oh, come on, little guy. Do you want to eat?
I used to think that the day would never come. I'd see the light in the shade of the morning sun. My morning sun is the drug that brings me near to the childhood I lost, replaced by fear. I used to think that the day would never come, that my life would depend on the morning sun, that the day would never come.
There is a lot to talk about when it comes to The Last of Us Part 2. I could discuss this game for hours upon hours. A single video like this isn't enough. The purpose of this video was to sort out my thoughts, as I have been thinking constantly about it ever since I beat it. And those thoughts are a chaos. It's an intense and emotionally draining game, and I absolutely loved it. It devastated me for weeks after finishing it. Even now, a whole year and a half after beating the game, after countless procrastinations to make this video, I'm still thinking about the game constantly. I'm glad I experienced the game the way I did. and it's an experience I won't forget. I believe that taking my time to accept the direction this game took and just rolling with it was the best choice I could have made. This game is not flawless, there are some things it could have done differently, but it doesn't matter in the end, for me at least. It has a lot of contrived moments, yes, like how does one-handed Yara show up out of nowhere just in time to help Abby? How do Tommy and Jesse get to the aquarium just after Ellie killed Owen and Mel? How does Abby just stumble upon Joel and Tommy? These are things that people who already dislike the game point out as big flaws. But guess what? Many of the most acclaimed movies and games have contrivances like these. Do we talk about those? No, we shake them off. Why? Because they don't matter in the grand scheme at all. How many pieces of media have moments where someone arrives just at the right time at just the right place and absolutely no one cares about that contrivance? The criticism I do understand though is that some people dislike all the seemingly random deaths in the game. Deaths that don't really have any build-up. I believe the idea behind it was to show that everyone is always vulnerable and that in real life you simply don't always get a satisfying arc. You kill dozens of NPCs who also die randomly when you disregard that you're playing a game with enemies that have been placed in certain spots. And here lies the issue for certain people. These random deaths lose their randomness and believability for them because they have been orchestrated by the developers and additionally can feel like heavy-handed storytelling tools. The deaths of Manny, Isaac and Yara come to mind. Yes, I'm not counting Jesse among those because his death, in my opinion, had some build-up. His death was pretty much an immediate consequence of Ellie killing Owen and Mel. This is a very difficult thing to nail in such a story because it can definitely feel forced. However, in a game where you kill so many people who the game humanizes by giving even the most relevant ones individual names and people who break down in confusion when they see their dead bodies, in a game that puts story-related characters on an equal playing field as standard enemies in their mortality, in a game that sets up right from the start with Joel that death can come when you least expect it and constantly reinforces that theme, I very much believe it works. The Last of Us Part 2 doesn't really feel like a game to me, it doesn't feel gamey. All of its systems are so carefully put together to fully immerse you. The attention to detail is unparalleled, from the wolves calling each other by their names and coordinating to flank you, the Seraphites communicating via whistles, to the little stories told through environments and notes. All the subtle visual cues and details in animation and design is astounding. It's the most visceral game I have ever played. The violence feels disturbingly real. Intentional or not, it's also quite disturbing how desensitized you can become to the game's violence over time, just like Ellie in a way. I can't forget to mention the sheer contrast between the relentless brutality and the calm and beautiful moments. Coming across the scene in the music shop after an intense combat encounter was brilliant. That goes for all the little character moments, especially between Ellie and Joel, Ellie and Dina, and even Owen and Abby. The way this game shows just how fleeting happiness is and that we have less time than we think, it really hit home for me. And the music, my god, the music, simple but damn effective. All these things make it very easy for me to overlook the game's flaws. It was an experiment and I'm so glad that it worked for me. It's not the game we wanted, but it's the game we needed, or at least that I needed. How do you even rate a game that has flaws you recognize, yet that has given you one of the best gaming experiences you've ever had? Do you rate it in the most objective way you can, or the most subjective? If I choose the former, it might be an 8 or a 9, but if I choose the latter, it can't be anything less than a 10. There's nothing else like it, and it got to me more than any other game in recent memory. In the end, after going through this roller coaster of a game, as many others before me, I have to accept what happened, and as much as I don't want to, and even though my mind will surely drift back to it, I have to move on.